Chai FM, 101.9 megahertz of life.
I've been greatly looking forward to having this conversation this morning in Transfer Talk with Taryn Harris, who's a partner and co-founder of Harris Marcus Mahlangu Attorneys, because it's such an interesting topic, and it doesn't just talk to property sales. It actually talks to human nature. It talks to expectation. It talks to communication. And what on earth are we going on about is what are defects, what needs to be disclosed, and what doesn't. And I was just saying to Taryn during the music break that someone who lives in a house, and this is the question that I really have, someone's lived in a house, let's say, for 20 years. Some things might not be defects to them. It's just their house. So what are they meant to, it's such an interesting conversation. Taryn, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Howard. Happy belated birthday for yesterday.
Thank you. But this must be one of the most frequent areas of conflict, I would imagine.
The bane of an agent and an attorney's existence in property, because everyone is so excited to buy a house.
Yes.
And then the buyer moves in. And then the buyer is expecting, they've just spent a fortune of money on a property. They move in. And when you're in a home, you start noticing things, which you might not have seen on one or two walkthroughs, which I have brought to your attention, I think even in my very first show, that people spend more time studying when they buy a car than they do when they buy a property. So, and that brings me back to, did you get an inspection report done? But most people, I would say at least 95% don't. And they bring family in, or they go through one or two walkthroughs, and they might see a cracked tile here and there, and then they move in. And then they start living, as you say, and breathing in the home and seeing all these things. So, first of all, the Property Practitioners Regulatory Authority brought in a few years ago this idea to have a mandatory disclosure, which I believe Mark had mentioned and Dylan on his earlier in the week. And this is vital. And in fact, an agent shouldn't take any mandate until such time that this has been given by the seller, because the seller is disclosing what the agent is actually selling. So there's a benefit for a seller to disclose because it reduces their liability. If they're disclosing, and it has very leading specific questions in the disclosure about air conditioning, about roof, about plumbing, about all of these sorts of things, that the seller doesn't have to think, have I seen anything? They can literally go through the list and it's a checkbox. What's very important to note, Howard, and this is where buyers and sellers often don't see eye to eye, is the report deals with actual knowledge. Now, that raises a few questions, because what if a tenant has been living in a property and the tenant doesn't disclose anything in particular, and the seller, before selling, goes to view the property, walks through or whatever, but they're not the one who's having a shower in that home every day. They're not the one who every day is using that kitchen. So they obviously need to be aware of what's going on in their home, but it's actual knowledge, not constructive knowledge. Now, constructive knowledge is what they should have been aware of.
A reasonable person in that position, right.
But the disclosure deals with actual knowledge, which is, it means actual notice or knowledge to a certain fact or state of affairs. So in other words, they actually had to have that knowledge of the defect. That's what they're disclosing. So now the problem is, if the seller doesn't have that actual knowledge, they're going to state they're not aware of it. So now it brings me to, there's two different types of defects. You've got patent defects and latent defects. Now, patent defects are the type of defects that if a buyer used a reasonable measure of care going through the property, it is those sorts of defects that they would see. They would see, for example, that there's damp in an area. They would see that. Just
to be clear, we're talking latent.
Patent.
Oh, patent. Okay.
Patent. These are obvious to the naked eye.
Okay.
So these are ones the seller should see, the ones that should be disclosed, that you can point them out, The buyer would be aware of them if they're doing a reasonable inspection, walking through.
Right,
They don't
right.
require any extra care to notice. Right, patent defects.
Got it.
So these are the ones that the seller should be disclosing because they're aware of it. Latent defects is what becomes tricky. Latent defects are those defects that you wouldn't
A
see.
leaking swimming pool, which you wouldn't have noticed necessarily because the pool is filled for show day. It looks lovely, but it's actually got a leak.
But maybe the seller, if they're living in this house, would know about it because
So if they knew, then it could be a latent defect.
If they knew, it's a latent defect, but to the seller, it's patent because they would notice the water leaving. It wouldn't
okay.
be necessarily
Yes,
patent to
okay.
the buyer.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
So a latent defect, I had a situation where a seller had lived in an apartment, a flat for 30 years, and then she needed to go into an old age home. Her son rented it out. She'd showered in this property. She'd lived in this property. She knew it. She had visited it every so often before selling it. It sold. The buyers moved in. The agent had sold it, checked all the taps. Their parents had done so. The buyer moved in and said there's a big plumbing issue and
Right.
got an expert in.
Okay.
Okay, an expert being a plumber, someone specialized
Who
in
knows
that
that
field.
field, right?
Who realized that the taps inside had actually been installed back to front. So not the actual hot and cold were
Yes,
reversed,
but the actual taps.
but the actual inside unit was back to front. So although you were still getting water out, it was also leaking inside. But the problem was when other flats and units had started renovating, it created this problem to come to the forefront, which previously it hadn't.
Right.
So
they wouldn't have known.
they wouldn't have known. And there was
Right.
corrosion and it was causing all kinds of problems. But leading up to that point, the seller had no actual knowledge. Now, the buyer said they should have had constructive knowledge. A reasonable person would have known what's going on over this. And I said, no. Actual knowledge is actual knowledge. And the only way you were able to figure this out was by getting an expert in. Now, at some point, the Footstoots clause has to prevail. Because if the seller couldn't have known it through actual knowledge and they don't disclose it, they're not hiding anything, you take a property, you're buying something that is not brand new. You're buying something that's a living, breathing thing that changes and there's problems and movement and heat and cold and earth shifts and things happen. And unfortunately, when you buy a property, you buy it with warts and all. Unless it's been disclosed, unless the seller should have done it. Now it's a completely different issue if there was damp and the seller has now painted over it. I've had issues
So
like
there
this.
they've deliberately hidden it.
Correct. I've had
Right.
issues like this where they've done a patch job, they've painted it, they said they had no knowledge, and later it came out that there was damp there. When the
Interesting.
purchaser got an expert in, they could actually see that this had been there and was covered up. Now, that's a very different, because now you're dealing with misrepresentation. And now what you need to look at is the defect big enough that it would have either allowed the buyer to make a lower or reduced offer, or would the buyer not have entered into this transaction at all? Now, those sorts of things are, then now you're going into the realm of litigation. Now they've got this property. What are their recourses? And it's tricky as a conveyancer because conveyancers are there to represent both parties fairly. I mean, that's what we have to do.
Yes.
So if it becomes a litigation matter and it goes down that road, the conveyancer who's doing the transfer is not allowed to represent one party over the other. They actually need to hand that over.
Yes.
So we get involved in these after-sale issues a lot to give advice, which we can do to a point.
But does it talk to, my concern around this is it is very, very much about human behavior and sometimes even just their own perception.
100%. And you get people who understand, who've bought lots of homes, they
Yes,
know, and they,
yes.
you know what? this doorknob's fallen off, or this, we've just gone through the rains and now this door's not closing properly. I will get a handyman to come in
and just sort it and carry
fix
on.
it.
Yeah.
You get other people who are like, no, I've spent all this money. This wasn't declared to me. The seller must fix it. So, and you get different personalities than as the seller. You get sellers who are like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I sold you a property that's not what you expected. I will get someone to come in and sort it out. After the transfer goes through, you get sellers like this. You get other sellers that say, you know what? No, I wasn't aware of it. It was covered by footsteps.
Yeah, exactly.
It's your problem now.
Right.
So, and now you're dealing with personalities.
Neil wants to know, is there a type of statute of limitations on these issues?
So
It's a great question, actually. How long do you have to deal with this?
So statute of limitations is the same in all law. In all areas of law, I can be corrected if there's a litigation attorney out there. But to my knowledge, I believe it's 2 years from the time that you became aware of it.
Okay, so it is a while.
It's a while, but I say 2 years, but at the same time, you have to be able to prove that the seller had actual knowledge and hid it. So it's very difficult to prove that unless you get an expert in that says, listen,
yes,
they painted over the dam.
The
The expert in the situation that I had dealt with, the plumber's report confirmed that the hot water taps flow were installed in the wrong direction. It was behind the wall, and probably only with the other units being renovated, it came to light.
Yeah.
So how would you know that? So, I mean, it's really, you have to look at the expert opinion in the instance of a latent defect to determine, should the seller, I mean, are they lying? How do you determine actual knowledge, especially if you've had a tenant in?
Yeah, if that situation removes you even further from the actual property. So your advice in trying to sum this up, I would think, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is going back to making sure that you bring an expert in. Because that's going to and someone to inspect the property for you when you're buying, on the buying side, so that you can deal with these things. And on the seller side, make sure that you have disclosed all of these items. Don't think you're being smart by not disclosing them, because it can come back to bite you.
So yes, but as I've mentioned previously, if you get an expert to come in, it causes two issues. Number one, you need to limit it. So you need to say, it will only affect the purchase price if the damages are more than 20,000 or more than 50,000, or it's because you're going to have issues.
They're going to have that's their job.
Every single home is going to find. So you need to limit what they're actually looking for and the value.
Yes.
That's very important.
Right.
The second problem this creates, now the seller gets this report and the buyer doesn't take the property. Mm-hmm. Now they know all the issues that's wrong with their property. To what extent are they now having to disclose?
Wow.
So there's a whole...
Puts them in a very difficult position.
Correct. The other issue is, if you're prepared to spend 15,000, 20,000 rand on a report, you can also spend 15,000, 20,000 if there's handy issues or small.
And you could have just done that.
And you could have just spent 7,000 rand to fix this or 5,000 rand to fix that. And it's still cheaper than getting an expert report. So I think you need to weigh up the size, the value, your commitment to the property, and what expense you're going in when you're buying it.
And I would add one more thing. Make sure, ask an attorney. Get hold of an attorney, because the more we have these discussions, the more I realize how important it is.
And get someone on your side before. You don't, you have the power to nominate an attorney as the seller before even an agent's involved.
Yeah.
Ask them to help you.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And get an experienced agent.
Taryn Harris, we do need to leave it there. Partner, co-founder of Harris Marcus Mahlangu Attorneys. You're going to be away for the next 3 weeks. We will miss you, but we look forward to having you back. Travel safe, enjoy every moment, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you so much.